You are watching What Wise Women Want here on Charlottesville's Public Access Channel 13. Every week we speak about topics that are relevant to you. Ladies, we are 52% of the population with 85% of the purchasing power. Let's use that power to make informed choices for ourselves, our children, and our families and our community. Our topic this evening will be death of a child. We have a few ladies here, including myself, who are going to be talking about stillbirths, miscarriages, and the death of an infant. I think many times in our culture, you won't believe how many young women and all kinds of women have miscarriages and have had miscarriages who are probably sitting right next to you right now. So this is a topic we will be talking about. To my right, we have Kathleen Olowin. Kathleen is author of a book called Angels in My Heart. Mm-hmm. To her right is Ann Postak. Ann is a counselor, and she counsels for loss of a child. So ladies, the first thing we're going to do is have a bit of a conversation about your experiences with this topic. So Kathleen, we'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your what it was that happened to you?
Well, I have had 3 first trimester miscarriages very early on in the 6 to 7 week range of pregnancy. One of them was my oldest son's twin, and we didn't find out about that loss until after he was born. And then I had 2 first trimester miscarriages when my son was 3 years old, back to back, about 3.5, 4 months apart. We had another successful pregnancy and a second son, and when he was about 3 years old, we lost our son Nicholas at 16 weeks gestation. It was the end of the 4th month of pregnancy. And we have 2 younger children, successful pregnancies after that.
So you've had several.
We have lost 4. We have 4 living children and 4 that we have lost along the way.
Okay. Ann, would you tell us a little bit about your story?
Well, my story begins in 1983 with the birth of our first son, Christopher, who was premature. And then about a year later, I got pregnant again and lost that baby. And I have to say that that was probably one of the hardest because it was my first loss. And I thought, I didn't know anybody else who lost a baby at that time. And I thought, wow, something's wrong with me, something I did wrong. Then about a year later, I did get pregnant again, and with our second son, Matthew, and lost his twin, like Kathleen lost twin early on in the pregnancy, but Matthew made it through, again premature, but he made it through. Then we ended up all together, I would say, instead of going through the whole story, which could take a while, 5 miscarriages. And then we have lost a daughter who was almost a year old when we lost her. So altogether, we lost 6 children. I have 5 surviving children from age 31 down to 10. So with Anthony, our youngest, at 10, I was told I would never carry another child that late in life successfully, and I did. So it can happen. There's always hope.
So you, between the 2 of you, well, between the 3 of us, because I too have lost a child as well, several actually. And what I want to start talking about is, let's start with the age of miscarriage. Start with miscarriages. Since we've all had them, what kinds of experiences did you have? I know what the experiences that I had when I miscarried. Everyone expected me to go back to work the next day and, get up out of bed and don't talk about it anymore. And I did not have the opportunity to go because of in those days, no, they didn't do anything for you. And I didn't have the opportunity to grieve my child or bury it or even give it a name. So talk a little bit about the kinds of experiences you've had with miscarriages, because I know you were talking earlier about statistics. Give us the statistics on miscarriage, Kathleen.
Miscarriages are actually very common. Most medical people will tell you about 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. I think that may even be more frequent than that because people are determining that they are pregnant very much sooner in a pregnancy than they used to. You can now take a test before your cycle even would begin, and it'll respond yes or no. There are probably about 1 million women a year just in the United States who experience a miscarriage every single year. And an additional 26,000 babies are stillborn. And the definition of a stillbirth is from 20 weeks gestation on. So if you lose a pregnancy prior to 20 weeks, it's considered a miscarriage. If you lose a pregnancy after 20 weeks, it's considered a stillbirth.
Okay. And I just saw a program on the other day, actually yesterday, that talk about when do we consider consciousness, the child to be human or to have human consciousness. And it was ascertained by these scientists, some say age 25 weeks in utero. So I find that interesting, that it was 20 weeks that all these numbers are so arbitrary. And another scientist actually said age 2, that was the time consciousness, the child was conscious. So, but in any event, just keep in mind that many of these numbers are arbitrary, but we're just trying to give you pieces of information here that will be beneficial to you. Tell us about your, what it was like with your miscarriage.
The first one, like I said earlier, was much more traumatic, not only from my perspective, but from my husband's. I was not treated like I had just lost a child. Mm-hmm. I was treated like it was a medical condition. And that made all the difference on how I reacted to it and how I grieved, or I should say how I was not allowed to grieve. Right. Because it wasn't recognized as losing a child back then. With each subsequent one, I learned from them of how to address them myself, where I would name the child and we recognize the child within my family and myself. Because when a woman becomes pregnant, from the moment she's pregnant, she's accepting that baby as her baby.
Right.
So when you lose that baby, it's a very personal experience for us, because as soon as we're pregnant, our hormones are changing. Mm-hmm. Our body realizes we're pregnant. As soon as we lose that baby, our hormones are changing immediately, and you recognize something is gone.
Right.
So for us, it's a child. It's something our bodies recognize as well as us emotionally. So it's important to name that child that you have lost, because you've got to be able to grieve the loss of that baby. And without a name, the grieving process really can't start. You've got to name the baby to start the grieving process. Once the grieving begins, then you can start healing and getting on. Mm-hmm. It is work. It's not easy. It's something you have to work at.
So did either one of you bury your child?
Yes.
You both did?
Yes, one of them.
See, I didn't have that opportunity.
Only the last one did I have the opportunity.
And you had a funeral service?
The last one we had just a very small service with our pastor. The ones before that, I didn't have the opportunity. I was never given the baby. I was never told I could have the baby's remains. I have since found out that you can.
Right.
And I've also since found out that you don't have to go to a hospital every time you lose a baby either. You can grieve and lose your child within the confines and love of your home and your family.
Right.
You don't have to run off to the hospital as I thought you had to.
Right.
And I was actually told when we lost our son Nicholas at 16 weeks and I delivered him at home. And I asked my midwife on the phone, should I go to the hospital? And she said, unless you are hemorrhaging, bleeding excessively, there's nothing they can do for you. Be more comfortable at home. Stay at home. And we did bury Nicholas. He is buried in a cemetery. We had a small graveside service with the pastor of our church, who was very, very generous to offer to do a full funeral mass for us. He had never dealt with a family who had a premature baby die, and he didn't know what to do, and he said, we will figure this out, what do you want? And we decided not to do a full funeral mass. knowing now what I know, if I could go back and do it again, I might change that, because I would have had the community support that was kind of lacking. We were brand new to the church. We had just changed parishes. We didn't feel it was the right thing, but it was offered to us. And that gave me the sense that my child was recognized as a full human being. And we did bury him. We had a small graveside service, and we do go visit the grave with our other children. But the other 3 were too early in the pregnancy to have had a remains to bury.
See, and I think that's part of the problem, because our society does not recognize a miscarriage of 20 weeks as a human being. And so we are not treated as if we have lost a child. And so I know, it's been 30 years for me, and we're sitting here having this conversation, and I'm actually welling up, because it really, time passes, but the whatever that grieving is, and it took me, and I think I told you ladies this story, but I never grieved the death of my children. And what happened was that one day I was 40 years old, and I was backing out of the driveway with my children in the car, in the station wagon, and I heard this squealing noise, and apparently one of the kittens who was just born had been in the wheel well, and I ran over it. And as I backed out of the driveway, and my poor sons had no idea what happened to me, because for some reason or other at that moment, my body decided to grieve the death of my children. And I laid in a fetal position on the driveway, and I was 3 days, I was sobbing. I had no idea. And this seemed like an extreme reaction to the death of a kitten, but I realized later that in fact I had never grieved the death of these children, and it brought it up for me, which is the really sad part of our culture, in not recognizing that even though there is not a body here, typically as we would recognize it as a child, it's still to us, the mother, we felt it inside of us.
That unresolved grief will carry over for a lifetime. And it really needs to be addressed, because other issues, like, with your reaction, they're going to pop up in different ways. And unless we address those issues, they're going to go unresolved.
Yep.
And the first step you need to take is to recognize, number one, you've got to name that child, grieve that child, and ask other people to recognize the child. Recognize the day that you lost the baby. And friends will always say, what can I do? One thing a friend can do is remember the anniversary of the miscarriage or the death of the child. You don't have to find a special card, just a note that says, I remember.
I'm thinking of you today.
I'm thinking of you today. That's all it takes, just for a mom to know that somebody else remembers their child. Give other people permission to talk about your loss.
Right.
Because some people think, it'll bring up bad memories.
Right.
It's just the opposite.
Right.
I want my children recognized.
Right.
I want those beautiful memories of Kathleen surfaced. I want her picture, shown around. It feels good to recognize those children. So it's not bringing up bad memories.
No.
Those are emotions that were good, those pregnancies, those babies. So it's good to talk about it. And sometimes we have to give our friends permission to talk about it.
And even when it's a painful topic, my heart is hurting because this baby is missing. Don't think that I'm not thinking about it every single day. And people will say, well, I didn't want to say anything to you. I didn't want to make you feel bad. How can you make me feel bad? I feel bad already. What makes me feel bad is the silence.
Right.
And the fact that nobody's acknowledging this member of my family is no longer here.
Well, how do people treat you in general? I said that everybody had the expectation I just go right back to work, and nobody thought about what, it was just kind of all gone, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And how did people treat you all?
My favorite comment that sums that up is someone who said to me about 3 months after Nicholas died, "Are you still dealing with that?" And that kind of became my catch-all phrase, because this person thought that was 3 months ago.
You should be over
You should be over that by now.
Yeah.
And I was sitting here thinking, I'm not even to my due date yet. I haven't escaped this pregnancy yet. This
Right.
pregnancy's not over. What do you
Right.
mean am I not dealing with that? And I didn't verbalize it to the person at the time. It was not an appropriate situation to, get into it. But in my head, I just was going, how can you even think that? If it were one of my older children, would you expect me to be over it?
So in the back of your mind was still the due date.
Oh, yeah.
That hadn't arrived
I
yet.
was not yet done with this pregnancy because I hadn't gotten past the point that it should be over.
It's almost as if people qualify the importance of children and the amount of loss by, well, she was just in her first trimester, second trimester. Oh, it was just a baby versus a teenager. It's all a loss, and you can't qualify it.
No.
I mean, who's to say if you're bearing two children and one is a year old and one is 2 years old, which one was the greater loss?
Right.
I mean,
Which one did you love more?
But that's how you're
Right.
treated.
Right.
It's like, because most of mine were lost within the first trimester, it was like with you, get back to whatever you do. You're healthy, you can get pregnant again,
Right. You can always have another.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one you can.
Just go on.
You can go
You can
get
You can
pregnant
have
again.
another one.
That's exactly what
Right.
the doctor said.
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
the way,
You can
came
have
in and said,
another one.
"Go ahead, go have another one." Not, I haven't dealt with this one yet, and you're
Right.
telling me to go off and have another one.
Yeah.
And then, after we lost Catherine, somebody said to me, it was about a year later, you should be over that by now. You don't ever get over it.
Right.
Right,
You learn how to deal with it better,
right.
and time makes it just a little easier, but you never ever, don't expect yourself to get over the loss of a loved one. And I do say the children that we have lost by miscarriage or stillbirth are as well loved ones lost.
What words can people use to talk to those of us who have had a miscarriage? I mean, I find myself, I know somebody who's really close to me right now. She's in her 20s and she just had, 30s, and she just had her first miscarriage. And the first thing I did, because it was still so raw the day I saw her, was I just held her and I didn't say anything. It seemed like words just couldn't express how I felt as much as just holding her, and she, started crying in my arms. And so what kinds of things can people say to those who have lost a child? What do you think the appropriate kinds of things are to say?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm
also
sorry.
kind of feel where they're coming from, because different people experience grief differently. Some women just want that hug. Some women just need to be in their bed for 3 days, and then they need something. So you have to kind of let them lead you what they need, and they will let you know. Sometimes you just need to say, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to say? I'm here.
I'm here.
Right.
Tell
I'm
me what
sorry.
you need.
Right.
Yeah, that was one of the hardest things, was people didn't say anything at all.
That's probably the worst.
And the silence is the worst. And people say, well, I didn't know what to say to you. Well, okay, but you can say, I'm thinking of you. You can
Yes.
say, I'm sorry.
Yes.
There's nothing you can say that's going to make me feel any better. There's no magic wand you can wave that's going to make this situation suddenly better. There's nothing that can take it away. So just acknowledge that I'm hurting and say, I'm so sorry. What can I do?
I think what we want is validation.
Right.
That we're
Yeah.
grieving, and validation that we lost a loved one. I think that's what every mom wants. We just want that validation that, yes, I realize that you have lost somebody that you love,
Right.
and I realize you're hurting.
Now we've been talking specifically about moms who have lost a child. We really haven't dealt with anybody else in the family, and I have another story to tell. And so when I was 9 years old, I lost my 3-year-old brother who had a brain tumor. And my parents didn't know how to deal with the death of a child their response was completely dysfunctional, and sent me off to school right after the funeral, which, by the way, the entire community participated in. We couldn't even get in the church. But what happened was the day I returned from school, which was about 3 days after the funeral, 2 of my friends came up to me and said something to me, and because I had never been allowed to grieve, I collapsed into tears and, basically had to run home. My father died about 3 years ago, and one of those girls showed up at my father's funeral and said to me, "I just want you to know how sorry I was for saying that to you when you were 9 years old." And I thought, oh my goodness, this woman has held on to this for so long. What is it in our culture that, people don't, are just so reticent about talking to us about these emotional kinds of issues? So I was a sibling, and we don't even think about the other children in the family with regards to how did you have other children who survived that? I know you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my children, because Christopher's 31, and he was able to understand each pregnancy that I had and each loss that I had, and so, as I started having more and more children and more losses, and then of course with Catherine, they were amazing. They were amazing. They were very supportive. They understood. I think children are more capable than we give them credit for. Mm-hmm. So don't think, well, we shouldn't tell the children because they didn't even know I was pregnant yet. Right. Or the thing is, you really need to tell your children when you get pregnant, as soon as you get pregnant, so they can go through what you're going through with you. Because you've got to recognize that child in order to grieve properly. And if you're hiding your grieving from your own children, you're not handling it properly.
Right.
That's not a holistic way to handle it.
Did you sit down and talk with your son?
Yeah, we talked with all of our children. When we found out we had lost a child, because they knew from the moment we found out we were pregnant the next morning or whenever, we're telling them that they're going to have a brother or sister. So when I lost the babies, we sat them down and told them that we had lost the babies and the babies are now in heaven. And, and they handled it beautifully. We talk about Catherine a lot more than the other ones because they held her. They knew her. They loved her physically. And so her picture's around, and so we do talk about her. One issue that's really tough for me still after all these years is when somebody says, "How many children do you have?"
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I want to say 11.
Right.
But then, then I feel like I have to justify, qualify, know?
Sure. Yeah.
That's a very, very good point.
It's
a
very
difficult
hard.
one.
It's a very difficult thing. And then I think, well, maybe I should say 6, but we lost our daughter. But then I negate the lives of the other children.
Right.
To keep things brief, when it's just a quick conversation, I'll say I have 5 children, and I'll say the ages are from 31 down to 10. And then they look at me, oh, you must have been married a couple of times and you've inherited some children.
Stepchildren.
So then again, I'm justifying,
exactly,
I'm qualifying.
Exactly.
But how much information does this person need? It depends on the situation. It depends upon if you're just meeting someone for the first time and they say, oh, how many children do you have? Well, do they need your life story?
Exactly.
Or do they just need an answer because this is small talk in a cocktail party?
Yeah.
And sometimes I will say I have 4 living children. Sometimes I will just say I have 4 growing sons and add others in my head, silently. And if it's really a situation where I feel it's appropriate, I will say I have 4 living children and 4 who aren't here.
That is really an important point that you're making. I didn't even think about that in preparing for this program, how many times I wanted to say more than, those who are living or I have this many living children. And it's to know those boundaries of the people you're with and the appropriate. It's really sad that we have to constantly walk on eggshells in terms of our story and who we are and telling the things about our life so that people understand who we are from many different perspectives. I mean, it's really fascinating.
And knowing when do you say how much?
Mm-hmm.
And
socially correct. We always have to be politically correct and socially correct.
And with each subsequent pregnancy, I had a hard time with, is this your first? Yeah. Or, I mean, do I say with my last one, do I say this is my 8th?
Right.
Well, it's my 8th, but not really.
I have to tell you, the most comfortable I am with that question is in the doctor's office when the nurse is taking the statistics.
That's the only place. Yeah.
How many pregnancies have you had? How many live births?
How many
And it's almost like,
yeah.
they understand.
I can say how many pregnancies. I can say how many live births. I could say I lost Catherine at a year, just before her first birthday, because it's being asked of me.
Sure.
But and I'm
what a wonderful introduction. How many children have you birthed? I mean, what a great introduction, except for the people who have adopted, like me.
Well, that's true. Yeah,
well,
that's right.
Yes, that's
right.
true.
But the other thing, too, is maybe we're not giving people enough credit. Maybe it's us that is having more of a problem by not saying something. Because I was telling Kathleen earlier, when somebody says to me they lost a child, then I tell them about my experience, and then we've got a lot to talk about, and we feel better. It's amazing how many people have lost children and don't talk about it.
Exactly.
So if we say we have lost a child, miscarriage, or by a sudden death, if we say that, we'd be surprised how much comfort we can bring to other women who have lost children as well, and their story will come out. So maybe by us not saying anything, we're losing opportunities to help other people.
And that is one of the things with miscarriage in particular, and neonatal death too, but one of the things that's so difficult is that this is a silent thing. That it's such a taboo subject that people don't say, this is what's happened to me. This is what's going on in my life, except maybe to close friends. But when you do get the courage to say to someone, I just had a miscarriage, I just lost a baby, you get the response from people. Right after I had the first miscarriage, we were at a retreat, and I hadn't told anybody, very, very few people, and nobody at that retreat knew. And I was really struggling at one moment, and one of these women that I had known for years came up and gave me a hug, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I just had a miscarriage." And she just hugged me, and she said, "I've been there." And I've known this woman for 20 years, and I didn't know that. She said, "I've been there. What can I do to help? You're not alone." That's the biggest thing, is to say you're not alone, because people feel so incredibly isolated and alone when this happens, because you feel like, how could anybody ever have had this happen? Now, it happens so frequently. 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. It's a very common thing, and yet we treat it as
a disease. Silent disease.
The medical field treats it as a, like, oh, well, 1 in 4 ends in miscarriage.
Right.
That's okay.
It's
You'll
frequent.
get over it.
You'll
It's
get
frequent.
over it.
You get over it. Go on. But it's a very taboo subject.
Right.
We're really trying, Anne is one of the people who's trying to kind of break that silence and talk about it.
Yes.
And I'm trying to get stronger about talking about it, and that was part of the reason for writing the book, was a way of doing it.
Kathleen and I have started up workshops as well that we do every once in a while, and we bring these women together who have lost children, infant death, or small children like myself, miscarriages, and we have found that there are women attendees that are in their 70s.
Yeah.
And they're breaking down and they're crying just as much as the women are in their 20s. Just as much sadness and grief is coming out of the older women as the younger. We have a Kleenex box, next in all the tables and next to everybody, and they're used. We cry together, and there's something very comforting about sitting next to somebody who has also experienced the same type of loss.
Right.
It's very comforting to have that. We call it sort of a sisterhood, really.
Exactly.
Yeah. In fact, a
Because
friend of mine said that.
My husband, as close as we are, we've been, married 35 years, dated 6 years before that. He's my best friend, but as close as we are, he has told me he cannot truly 100% understand how I feel.
Right.
Because he's a man.
Let's talk about the husband issue, because I hear how yours responded, and mine was completely in denial, went back to work as I was laying in the hospital. Came back to pick me up the next day, never wanted to talk about it again. and that was the way he dealt with death in general, not just, our child. How do, as you said, husbands don't know what it is that we're feeling. What's the best way to, help your husband? I mean, I'm guessing that many more husbands feel as much or equal to what we feel in terms of the anticipation of having the baby and then having the loss of a child. What can we do to help husbands in order to be able to bring them into the, discussion?
One way is to mention to the husbands and explain to them that physically they cannot understand what we're feeling because physically our hormones are affecting how we're feeling. They don't have those hormones. They don't know that unless we tell them that. So they need to know about this added dimension of our loss. And a lot of husbands are unaware of this. So inform them. Keep the lines of communication wide open.
Right.
If it's minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day.
Right.
There are some nights, it's been almost 20 years since Catherine died, but there are some nights where everybody's in bed and I'll go into my closet to change and I'll just break down. After 20 years, I go, where did that come from?
Right.
But it's important that I tell Jay that I'm still experiencing this.
Right.
So he doesn't think she's over it.
Yeah.
Because you're never over it.
Right.
No.
But it's important for them to understand that it's still coming back. And then ask them, how are you feeling today about it?
Right.
Well, let me do a little bit of a station identification here. You are watching Charlottesville's Public Access Comcast Channel 13. The program is What Wise Women Want, and today we're talking about the loss of a child. Those of us who are on the panel today have experienced either miscarriages, stillbirth, or the death of a neonatal child, and we are having an open discussion about that. To my right is Kathleen Olowin, author of Angels in My Heart, and to her right is Postak, counselor who works with people who have lost a child. And so we've gone through many different varieties of topics here. How can we help women understand the healing? What did you do to assist you in your healing process? Is there something specific, or, initially it's hit or miss because you don't realize that other people are going through it and you just kind of are silent. But is there a process that you went through? I know for me, I spent a lot of time being silent and withdrawing. That's what I did because I didn't know any better. My mother did not treat me as if I had the death of a child. She wanted to know when I was going back to work. So I had no idea that there were things that I could do to help me in my grieving process. I ignored it, was in denial, and then, years later started to deal with it. How did you deal with your healing process? Did you take any particular steps, or?
I'm not sure there are specific things you can say that would apply to everyone, because grief is a very individual thing. And some women who have a miscarriage early in the pregnancy will, process, move on quickly. Others, it will linger. There isn't kind of a checklist of you can do this, you can do that. I usually tell people when I'm working with them one-on-one and say, be gentle with yourself. Give yourself the time you need, and know that there is not a timeline by which this process of grieving this child has to happen, and that you will never fully get over. People say, when am I going to get over this?
Right.
You're not. You're not going to get over it. You're going to learn to go on. You're going to find a new sense of normal because you're a different person after this experience. In a little way, in a big way, you're a different person than you were before it happened. And so you will find a new sense of your normal. And that may take a couple of weeks, that may take a year, that may take 10 years to fully get to that point.
Right.
There are things that people will say, exercise is really good, eating well is really good to keep you from going into depression.
Well, that's the last thing I wanted to do.
Well, yeah, there's that.
I went the other extreme, frankly speaking.
Right.
I had a the only way I felt like I could deal with it is if I drank, and I didn't even realize what I was doing until the physician I had an ectopic pregnancy too, and he put a mirror in front of my face, and an ectopic pregnancy is when the baby grows in the tube, and then, it gets so big that the tube explodes. And, he put a mirror in front of my face and said, "You're alive, wake up,
live.
You live, stop drinking, you need to move from this."
Yeah.
And, my husband, supported this behavior by buying me alcohol. So, that's why I'm saying what kinds of things, and support groups, therapy,
Support groups
being
are helpful.
around people who, do churches have that kind of support? Is there a place
Depends.
where women can go to get that kind of support?
There is now a support group here in Charlottesville that meets the third Thursday of every month at Martha Jefferson.
Okay.
And it is a non-denominational group for anyone. We had a father and mother come together. Mostly it seems to be women who have come, in my experience. Guys don't tend to like to come to support groups.
Right.
This one was there with his wife. It was very fresh for them, so they were doing this together. But Martha Jefferson has a support group, if you can look it up on the web, the third Thursday of every month. Open to anyone, no need to RSVP, just go. And evenings, I think it's 7 o'clock.
Okay.
And it's a chance to be with other people who are living through the same experiences you are. Some may be further along in the process, but it gives you a chance to be with other people who have experienced what you've experienced in some form. Everyone's story is different. But there are also people for whom a support group would be a horrible idea.
Right,
I can't imagine
right.
sitting in a room full of people
Right.
talking about my story.
And who don't want to emote in front of other people,
That's true
or
too. Yeah.
or fear of doing that, would
Yeah.
not be beneficial for them either. So, private counseling
Private
is
counseling.
an alternative.
Yeah, there are also a lot of
Reaching out to other
reaching out.
people.
There are a lot of places on the internet where you can go. There are
Blogs.
there are Facebook groups. There are organizations that have chat rooms that have online support. I'm not big into the internet. I was not an option when I was going through this, so I didn't even know to look for it. But now there's a lot of online support for people who feel more comfortable in that world, being able to talk. There is one group a Facebook group that I am a part of that has members all over the world, and people will post things, and just a place that they can go and say, "This is how I'm feeling today. Has anybody else felt this way?" And they get 50 people writing back saying, "Yeah, I get it."
And another point I think it's important that we remember to bring up too is the what if question.
Yeah,
What if I did this different?
Ah.
What if I did that different?
right,
A lot of us carry, I used to carry some guilt around with me.
right.
And until you can let go of that guilt and forgive yourself, even if it had nothing to do with anything you did, which most of the time it's nothing we did,
No.
but
Yeah.
we feel like it
Right,
was because
right.
we're women. We should have been able to carry these babies all the way through.
Right.
Because I'm Catherine's mother, I shouldn't have let her die. I mean, that's always that little bit of guilt, even if it's unjustified,
Yeah,
that we have to deal with too. And all of us carry it. What if? What if?
right.
You
Logical or
have to
not.
be able to forgive yourself even for unjustified
Right.
reasons for
Right.
guilt.
Sure.
And that's very important to end the grieving, or to be able to deal with the grieving, I should say, because it never really ends. But it's those what if questions. You hear it a lot. And I know I was guilty of
Oh,
it
sure.
for a long time.
Yeah.
What if, what if, what if? So that's another thing you have to be able to let go of and forgive yourself for whatever guilt you may feel over it. And then the healing process can continue that way.
And for somebody who took 30 years, to finally deal with those kinds of issues, I understand completely what you're saying, because that what if question and the guilt question comes back over and over and over again if you allow it to.
Right.
And especially if you're not out there talking to other people, getting support in some way. But I also would like to talk about the people who are non-supportive. And, there are many, many people that I dealt with who in my processes didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to hear about it.
Right.
You know, sometimes I wondered if in fact that they too had the same experience, but didn't want to deal with their own grief. And as I see it now, you know, after having processed and working through some of it, I get weepy even talking about it 30 years later, and maybe that's embarrassing for people. What do you do with people who don't want to? I mean, how do you feel out a person who doesn't want to deal with this with you? And, you know, how can you tell the kind of person that doesn't want to deal with it?
Like, especially with me, with Catherine, you know, I have a picture and they could see what she looked like. And sometimes you just, I think if you have an attitude of how grateful you are for that child, of what a blessing that child was to you, you know, whether you were in your first trimester, second trimester, you know, stillbirth, any of that, if you have an attitude of how grateful you are that you had that child, then they're okay. You'll be surprised.
It's kind of hard to feel that way, though, initially.
Initially,
it is very
but
hard.
Eventually,
let's be honest, that's
you can
really
get there,
hard.
though.
Yeah.
It is hard, but you can get there. It is possible. I mean, it took me years to get there.
Right.
It's not something that's going to happen right away.
Right.
But you can get there. You know, at first, it is hard to talk about anyway.
Right.
Whether you're going to be, you know, it's very hard to talk about without crying.
Right.
Because it feels so unjust.
Yeah, it feels very unjust.
It's not life in the proper order.
But over time, you can find it. It is possible over time.
And, you know, I remember now rolling around the thought in my mind, oh God, why me? You know, feeling sorry for myself, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So those things all cross my mind too. I can't imagine what is the difference between whether it's societal or personally. What's the difference between having a miscarriage, which is the child, you know, prior to 20 weeks that really isn't formed and all of that, to having the death of a child who is either stillborn or, you know, within the first year? I mean, I can't imagine, I can't even think about going into my child's crib if they died of SIDS and there they are, you know, at 8 months old and they're dead. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must feel like. Is there in ourselves, at least for me, I don't feel the difference between the miscarriage and the death of a child who's already born. But for other women, I mean, and for yourselves, and for society as a whole, do you think that they see it as a difference?
I definitely think people see it as a difference. I mean, when you have a child who dies of SIDS, when you have a child like Catherine, you had the community. That community, be it your neighborhood or your church or your family, your friends.
Oh, my parish family just wrapped their arms.
Because there is a child at the table, there is a car seat in the car, there is a physical presence that is missing. Society comes around you and grieves the way they do when, you know, you lose a parent and people come to the funeral. When you have a miscarriage, particularly in the first trimester, there's nothing. There's no outward sign, there's no funeral usually, there's nothing that helps from the community, from the society, and this is why people retreat and don't talk about it, because there's nothing there that says, you know, this is the process we go through to help this family with this trauma.
And that's exactly why I do what I do as far as putting on the workshops.
Exactly.
For women who have lost babies, because they need that. It needs to be recognized by your parish, by your church, by your community. You need to have that recognition of this is a loss in a family, and it needs to be dealt with. So I think it's important that we have shows like this, and I want to thank you for doing this show.
Yes, definitely.
Because for years and years I would watch, you know, when I used to watch talk shows, I don't anymore so much, but I would look at these talk shows on TV and think, nobody does anything about women who have lost babies. It's so important. Why doesn't anybody have a show on this? And until, you know, the society, you know, changes its perspective on women who have lost these babies. So within your community, within your family, in your churches, if it hasn't been recognized as, women getting together to support each other, if you've lost a child, get something together. Start something up. It's not hard to do.
And I think one of the opportunities we also miss is to help our husbands as well, because our society is notorious for not allowing our husbands to feel in any way, shape, or form. They're supposed to be tough. They're supposed to be edgy. They're supposed to be masters of the universe and not feel the same kinds of feelings that women do, because obviously women who feel, it's powder puff and, here I am in pink today. But, I think one of the opportunities that we have with this as well is to really help men. If this is happening in 1 in 4 births, it's not just happening to the mother, it's happening to the father as well. And we do absolutely nothing to be supportive of these men, to help them talk about it. I mean, there is really nothing for them. And so they go into oblivion and really submerge all those feelings as well. And heaven only knows for men, because none of us are men on this panel, how those feelings come out for them. I mean, do they have to go play football and, get aggressive in order to be able to move that energy outward? I'm not sure.
Well, when we have these workshops, we have an opportunity for the fathers to get together by themselves. We'll have the moms go off into groups and discuss things, and we also provide an opportunity for the men, the husbands, to discuss things within themselves, in the context of what it is to be a father who has lost a child.
But that's if they come.
If they come, that's right. Sometimes they're not always there. One time we had a lot of dads. Another time I think we had one or two the last time. So if you can get them there, it's very helpful.
It's difficult to get them there because men in general don't like to talk about emotions. They don't like to talk about, they want to fix it. And if they can't fix it, they just want it to go away. So if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away. And even within my own experience, the first miscarriage I had, my husband didn't even know I was pregnant yet because we hadn't officially tested anything until it was after the fact when we found out, well, you were pregnant. But so he didn't deal with it because he wasn't an expectant father. He didn't lose anything.
Right.
And the second miscarriage, one night he looked at me and he said, now I understand, and I'm really sorry that you went through this alone the first time. I'm sorry I wasn't there. And I understood intellectually why he wasn't there, but it didn't change the fact that I was upset about it.
Well, one of the things I tell families when I work with families or couples is that men think in headlines, and women think in text. If you think about it as a newspaper, men think in in the titles of the story, and women think in the content and the rest of the text. Because I mean, like a wife will say to me, well, he came in and said so-and-so had, lost their child. And my question is, so what kind of child was it? What happened? How many pounds? Well, I don't know. I don't really care. It's just enough that I know that piece of information. Sure. So we think differently about how we and what's important and those kinds of things. And automatically, because of that, we kind of dismiss the rest of their feeling their feeling nature because of it. And
my experience with working with these women, and Anne probably can attest to this too, is that women like to talk about it again and again. And they just going through it once isn't enough.
Right.
They'll sit and have a conversation with you, and then tomorrow I can have a conversation with Anne, and I'm still willing to talk to somebody else. And guys don't like that. So oftentimes in a marriage, you'll find that there's stress between the husband and wife because she keeps talking about this, and he just is like, okay, I'm done with this. We've talked about it. It's over. Let's move on. And she needs to talk because she needs to validate and work through. Exactly. And she works through by talking. Exactly. And he works through in his head.
Exactly.
And I have a friend who finally figured out after they had their third loss that all the construction projects her husband was doing in the house, building bookcases and putting in new kitchen floors, was his way of grieving.
Yes.
And that finally, when it dawned on her, he does hurt. He just doesn't talk to me about it. He builds bookshelves.
Exactly.
He takes the hammer and he works his grief out in a
Exactly.
physical way.
Exactly.
And
those are the things we need to understand.
yeah, and I always tell couples, be gentle with each other and allow each other the process that you both need to take your own process, but don't lose touch with each other, because the loss of a child, be it in a first trimester or at a neonatal at any point, is the most stressful thing a marriage can endure. And marriages dissolve because people drift apart.
And one of the things that I see in therapy is couples stressing and separating over the death of a child, because for the very exact reasons that you were talking about, that that they didn't know how to communicate with each other, and so the wife thought the husband wasn't feeling anything or not being supportive, and so they grew apart. And so understanding that, I mean, we talk about the 5 languages of love, but we don't really talk about the languages of grieving. And how different people, and we're saying this about men, but there are women who also do not verbalize or want to talk about it endlessly like some of us do in order to be. And I think part of women's grieving is about the process of talking about it, is about also the more I talk about it or I attempt to help others, I'm helping myself.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're generalizing here in terms of it being women, but for the most part, that's what women do, and not necessarily, men as well. Was your husband? How did your husband behave?
He was very supportive from day one. In fact,
but I mean about his own feelings. How did he express himself?
Quiet. But that's his personality, and I knew that. So I didn't have a hard time with that at all. He was just very quiet. That was his way of dealing with it. And he was very protective of me, especially the first couple of months. I mean, he just wanted to put this bubble around me. So anything that could interrupt, my emotions at that point, he kept it away and just kind of protected me more than usual.
Because it was something he could do.
Yeah. So, and that was very helpful for me, having that extra protection and knowing that he was doing that for me was huge.
What do you think society can do to begin to, as you said earlier, I have yet to see people discuss these issues, radio, television. Part of that has to do, excuse me for saying this, but part of that has to do with the fact that most of the people who operate television and radio stations are men. And so they don't, from the top down, it's the station manager, it's, the administrators, it's even the people who are in front of the camera, the producers, most of them are men. And so these types of topics are not conducive to conversation. So they think, it's about rock'em sock'em and, getting people on edge and all of that, rather than issues about the heart. What can we do to, I've said this many times in many different places, what can we do to help society begin to open up to these kinds of topics? And here today we're going to be doing quite a few programs on topics that are never exposed on radio or television. So what can we do to bring these kinds of topics out to the fore?
I think the first thing we need to do is recognize that it's a child, it's a life that we lost in our family, and express that. My children know this, and as they grow up and they have their families, and hopefully they don't experience it, but if they do, they will recognize. And sometimes word of mouth, it goes pretty far, and I think an issue like this would go far. When my children have friends over and they see the pictures of Catherine, or they hear about our miscarriages, they realize we have family members that aren't with us. Naming your children shows something like even if you just wear a bracelet with the name of your child on it, somebody will ask you, who's so-and-so? You could tell them, just being a personal witness is huge, and who knows where that will take it. But I think that we all need to be very proactive in, this is a life, this is our member of our family that we have just lost. And it's important that you recognize this. And not only is it helpful for us, but I think it's helpful for everybody else. Because there's a lot of people out there who've lost children who don't feel like they have the right to recognize this as a lost family member, because it's not politically correct, or for whatever reasons it is.
Okay.
And I think in terms of society, doing what we're doing here today, starting to talk and say it's okay to discuss this, it's okay to bring this up, it's not a taboo subject, we need to talk. In previous generations, women lost babies. Children died in childhood all the time. We didn't have penicillin, we didn't have the medical care we have now. There was a lot more support out there.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and you have been watching Charlottesville's public access Comcast Channel 13, What Wise Women Want. And today we have been talking about death of a child. To my right has been Kathleen Olowin, who's author of Angels in My Heart, which is about her experiences in miscarriage. And to her right is Ann Postak, counselor who helps and assists people who have lost a child. If you'd like more information about us, you can go to our website, www.whatwisewomenwant.com, and remember, wise is spelled with a Z. That's www.whatwisewomenwant. You can see a list of our programming, you can see the list of our guests, and how to connect with all of our guests now and in the future, always listed on our website. Please join us again next week for a very stimulating conversation again, What Wise Women Want. I'm Dr. Daria Brzezinski, and thank you for joining us.